is Alan Mollahan, and I ask you about him from West Virginia because I remember first reading about the accusations in the Wall Street Journal, but I also remember it being fed by an organization like yours at the time. What's ever happened to and what were the accusations against him?
The accusations against Mr. Mollahan were, there were several, but most of them revolved around the fact that he was earmarking for a bunch of nonprofit organizations, and in return, the leaders of those nonprofit groups were heavily contributing to Mr. Mollahan's campaigns. So it looked like there was a direct link between the money that was going to the organizations and that money was going right back into Mr. Mollahan's campaign coffers. There also turned out to be issues where he hadn't disclosed everything he was required to on his financial disclosure forms about certain property that he owned.
And so what happened?
That investigation is still ongoing. It's been several years now, and I've not ever heard that it's closed, but it can't be that active given how long it's been.
But from your time in the Justice Department, when we hear this all the time, investigations ongoing, what really slows it down?
So many factors can slow it down. Just for example, if you're going to do an investigation into somebody like Mollahan, they're going to want to get his tax forms. And you'd think that the Department of Justice would call the IRS and get the tax forms right away, but that can be many, many months in developing, in getting a hold of those forms. Also, you have to understand that at the Department of Justice, particularly in the public integrity section, ever since September 11th, they've had very few resources. FBI agents and prosecutors have been diverted to terrorism and aren't spending the kind of time on things like public integrity investigations. So they don't have the staff to make those things go quickly.
What do you think of the corruption level in this town compared to when you first really got interested in this? Up or down?
I think it's probably down. I think so many people have come into Congress in the past few years who came in on cleaning up Congress. It was their platform. It was the very issue that they won on. So I think it's a huge change, particularly given that the Democrats swept in 2006 on this platform, again, of cleaner Congress. They campaigned on the culture of corruption because it was so bad. And it had become so bad under Tom DeLay, which is not to say, by the way, that the Democrats have never had that problem. When I worked for Congress, I lost my job in 1994 in Congress, in large part because when the Democrats lost the House, they lost it on corruption issues. There had been the House banking scandal, the House post office scandal, and the scandal involving former chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, Dan Rostenkowski. And the Democrats were just deaf. They were totally tone deaf to the issues of corruption. Newt Gingrich made it a platform of the contract with America, and they rolled in on that. And yet, astonishingly, 10 years later, the Republicans had forgotten all the lessons that they had learned, and they lost on the exact same platform. So history just repeats itself.
Have you ever met Tom DeLay?
No, I haven't.
One that's very visible, the last Democrat on the list here, it's very visible in this town, is Charlie Rangel. Correct me if I'm wrong, it started in the New York Times.
It did start in the New York Times, and the first story that we read about Mr. Rangel was about the number of apartments he was renting in Harlem at subsidized rates, and that has in fact drawn a lot of anger in New York City because it's so hard for people to get these rent-controlled apartments. But that was just one issue. He had too many of those apartments. One of them, he turned out, he was using for his political action committee, which is a violation of FEC law as well as New York law, which says these are supposed to be used for residences, not for businesses. And then it turns out he owns property in the Dominican Republic that he hadn't been disclosing on his the income from it on his financial disclosure forms. And then, to my mind, the most serious allegation came last, which is that he was he proposed a legislative fix for a company called Neighbors Industries that would have saved them billions of dollars in taxes in return for campaign contributions to the Rangel Center, a center that's being built onto City College of New York, and he was soliciting funds for it.
So whatever happened after these accusations were made?
Well, Mr. Rangel himself submitted a complaint to the House Ethics Committee, and he did that because he's trying to clear his name, and only members can file against each other, and there's a truce, so they won't file against each other. So he filed against himself for the House Ethics Committee to hopefully clear him. The House Ethics Committee, despite many months now, has not come back on that investigation. I think it will be hard for them to clear him altogether.
What's this Office of Congressional Ethics?
The Office of Congressional Ethics was designed by Nancy Pelosi when she was campaigning on this culture of corruption, as this was the answer of how they were going to fix the House ethics process. They were going to put in this independent Office of Congressional Ethics, and since, as I said, groups like ours aren't allowed to file complaints with the House Ethics Committee, and by the way, that was a Murtha change. Murtha didn't want anybody to be able to file with the House Ethics Committee, but so people like us can now file with the Office of Congressional Ethics. The problem with this Office of Congressional Ethics is it doesn't have any subpoena power, doesn't have real authority. All it can do is do a preliminary investigation and then refer a matter over to the House Ethics Committee if it needs further action.
It's chaired by David Skaggs,
Right.
former member of Congress, and this minority is Porter Goss.
Right.
These are former members of Congress. Do they lobby now?
You know, I don't actually know what either one of them does right now.
There are other former members on this list also. I think Mrs. Burke from California, and go down the list. But has there been any evidence that the OCE, the Office of Congressional Ethics, has changed anything?
No, although the Office of Congressional Ethics has really just gotten started. It's only in the past few months that they've started taking on any matters at all. And we've yet to see any evidence that they've done anything. Their staff director is a guy named Leo Wise, who comes from the Justice Department, who I think is a man of integrity and is a good prosecutor. But truthfully, I think he's going to be stymied by the setup of the organization itself.
So I'm a potential donor to your organization, and I'm meeting with you. What do you tell me?
I tell you about many of the things that you and I have discussed. I talk about the kind of actions that Crew takes, and I warn, by the way, all our donors that we are nonpartisan, and so if you're going to be upset that we're taking on a Democrat or a Republican, a specific person, we're going to end up having a problem. And we explain that we believe that honesty and integrity are important values, and those are what we are searching for in our political figures, and we're trying to push for those.
And how do you show me that you can be successful? I mean, what, you know, I'm going to give you $50,000, and how do I get my money's worth out of this?
Well, I show you our history, and I talk about what we've done. I talk about the fact that we were the group that wrote the ethics complaint that was filed against Tom DeLay after a 12-year truce, and that it did lead to Mr. DeLay being admonished by a unanimous ethics committee. I talk about Mark Foley. Mark Foley was the member of Congress who was sending inappropriate sexual messages to some teenage pages. I say that when Crew got those messages, we were the only ones who did the right thing with them. I sent them over to the FBI as soon as I got them because I knew that they were a problem. It looked to me like Mr. Foley might well be a sexual predator, and I wanted an investigation. But because I didn't know I didn't even know about the authenticity of those emails. I didn't make them public at the time because you ruin somebody's career merely by making such an allegation. So we sent them to the FBI, which chose ultimately not to do anything with them. That came out much later. Republicans tried to say that this was an October surprise, that Crew had released this information when it was not true. We'd sent it to the FBI in the previous July. But I explain how this is what we do. We try to do the right thing. We try to put the information where it belongs, get it to the right people, and then leave it to the American people to judge.
Why didn't the FBI do anything with it?
I think that that became a complicated issue for the FBI. I think he was a member of Congress, and he was the head of the Exploited Children's Caucus, and they were loath to look into that. I think that it was also a matter of they didn't really have somebody with the right experience in that section of the FBI, again, because so many of their resources have been diverted to terrorism. So I think they, through a series of blunders, failed really to look into it. They ultimately decided it wasn't worth looking at.
Go back again to Tom DeLay. You filed it with, go back to the timing on this. When did you file your complaint?
That was in 2004, and we didn't file it. Former Representative Chris Bell, a member from Texas who had lost his seat because he'd been redistricted out of it because of Tom DeLay, he agreed to file the complaint for us. By then, we'd been shopping around for a while the idea of filing an ethics complaint, but as I said, there's been this long-standing truce, and no one was willing to file a complaint against Mr. DeLay, even though people regularly agreed that there were big problems there. But then I was introduced to Chris Bell, and he was willing to file it because he was both on his way out and he thought everything Tom DeLay was doing was terrible.
So did you write the complaint?
I did write the complaint.
And did you personally write it?
I personally wrote it.
And then so you handed it to Chris Bell.
I handed it to Chris Bell, who worked with me on it, who read it through several drafts and had comments on things he liked, didn't like, and we worked on it together.
And then physically what happens then once you give it to him and he gives it to?
Physically, he had to bring it and carry it down to the House Ethics Committee himself.
Then did you make it public?
Oh, sure. In fact, Chris Bell made it public. There was a big press conference, and it was a huge deal at the time because no member had filed an ethics complaint against another member in so long because of this long-standing truce. And so that Mr. Bell was willing to do this against the majority leader was obviously a very big press issue.
What do you think? If he wasn't on his way out, would he have done it, do you think?
I think it would have been hard for him to do it because he was under pressure. He wasn't just afraid of Mr. DeLay. There was a lot of pressure by the Democratic leadership not to do this. You have to remember there was a truce, so the Democrats and Republicans had agreed that no member would file